This video starts the discussion of environmental policy in the United States. We're going to focus a bit on some of the problems related and conflicts within society over environmental policy and why government has actually needed to get into the business of regulating the environment by taking a look at Garrett Hardin's Tragedy of the Commons. So let's define environmental policy from Craft and Furlong. We use their textbook definition. Environmental policy is a set of natural systems that interact in complex ways to supply humans and other species with these necessities of life, such as breathable air, clean water, food, fiber, energy, and the recycling of water. It's a rather broad way of describing that environment is basically everything that keeps us alive, really. And environmental policy then becomes the way in which government seeks to affect this larger ecosystem that we live in and making the world and the planet livable for people. Now, one of the things that we see is that environmental policy really, in many respects, is one of the most conflictual set of policies that we would have. Go back to Lowy's typology from earlier in the semester. In many cases, policies related to the environment are regulatory or redistributive, in which there's conflict between groups over who gets the benefits of environmental policy and who doesn't. And usually there are certain concentrated costs that end up costing some in society to the benefits of others, which makes environmental policy a very, very difficult thing to get passed. And it doesn't always resound to the fact that it's a Democrat versus Republican issue. Typically, Republicans focus more on economic growth and are less concerned with environmental policies than are Democrats. But oftentimes, what really makes a difference is what state that you come from. If you happen to be from a state that, for example, produces a lot of coal, like West Virginia or Pennsylvania, those states are very much more difficult to be able to pass environmental regulations in. And you might have a Democratic senator, for example, from West Virginia trying to hold up something that would affect coal policy and so forth. So really, this is comes down to really, in many respects, a clash between economic growth for some people and environmental policy in others. The classic economy versus environment isn't always true, but some regions of the country can lose out to others. So when we think about this as a clash of values, it goes a little bit beyond just, do you like the environment or don't you like the environment? Environmental policy, I think, is really what we would call a valence issue, which means that there's nobody against having a clean environment. It's just whether or not we want, how much environmental regulation do we want, and what forms should it take. So if you think about it, there are certain fundamental values that Americans hold that in many respects clash with the idea of the government coming in and dealing with problems of the environment. Think about the idea of ownership and regulation of your own private property. The belief that this is my property, I can develop this as I need fit, I can come up with my uses without the government telling me what I need to do. Individual rights, the limited role of government, and kind of this dedication to economic growth in the United States, that as the economy grows, more people will have jobs, more people will, the tide will rise and everybody will rise with it. All of these things are general values that we hold as Americans, but they do in some respects clash with this idea of environmental policy. So one of the big problems that we face when we look at the idea of environmental policy is what we can call the problem of externalities. And this is more or less a term that comes from economics. we can define externalities as that exist when the activities of one economic unit affect the well-being of another, and no compensation is paid for the benefits or cost created externally. So pollution, I think, is the ultimate externality. In other words, let's just say you're taking a look at that plant in the lower left-hand corner that's producing, say, electricity, maybe from coal, and that pollution is coming out of the plant into the air and being dispersed within the air, creating air that is not as breathable as it otherwise would be in its natural state. What happens to that company? Are they paying for that pollution? No. What they're doing is they're releasing that, even though that may be regulated by the government, but that pollution is going into the air, and everybody has a cost associated with that. That may be global warming. It may be, in many cases, if you happen to live near there, higher instances of things like asthma and other lung problems as a consequence of that. But in respect, that plant does not pay for the problems that it creates, and that's an externality. So that's where the government steps in, and really, this is what we call a market failure, where there is no natural mechanism within a laissez-faire economic system to punish that plant for ruining externalities. So that's one of the big things that we see, the rationale for government getting involved in environmental policy, is that these things are not something that most likely would take place naturally in a non-regulated market. Although there are some people that argue that's not the case, but generally that's what most people argue. So let's take a look at a theory that's very well known and used when we discuss this idea of externalities. And it goes back to a gentleman named Garrett Hardin, who in 1968 wrote about the tragedy of the commons. And the commons were those areas oftentimes used in medieval life where there would be additional lands provided by the lords or whoever owned the property for people to be able to use on their own. And what Hardin says is that we have this natural tendency, or should we say natural clash, between self-interest and the collective good. And unfortunately, oftentimes when we act in our own self-interest, we are creating results that are good for ourselves, but are not good for society as a whole. So again, go back and think about this plant that we had here. That may well be making a lot of money individually for the owners of that plant, but it's being harmful to the collective good because of the pollution that it produces. So he's discussing this idea, the tragedy of commons. Now, let's take a look at this idea in his own words. This is an interview a while back, but he's talking about the tragedy of the commons and resource allocation.